Communism and capitalism, normal for decades in China. Consumption in everyday life, Marxism in the constitution. For President Xi Jinping, this isn't a contradiction. A monument of Marx in his birthplace of Trier. The statue, a gift from China, causes protests. NDR and CGTN are discussing China's global influence together with experts. Which risks are associated with China's multi-billion investments in Germany? Are Germany and China headed for total escalation in their trade disputes with the United States? And what does China's technical progress mean domestically and globally? Insights and perspectives in dialogue with China.
Hello and welcome to this dialogue. My name is Andreas Zickowitz. It is 200 years since Karl Marx was born, and his theories and findings seem to be more alive than ever. Globalization, digitalization, artificial intelligence, these are posing new challenges. Marx is one of our topics today. When talking about China, it's not only about know-how, it is always about know-who too. And that's why we invited these knowledgeable experts, and somebody I know quite well, my colleague from CGTN presenter, Yang Ray. Ray, you went to Trier, to this small town, to find out more about Karl Marx. How did you like it?
First of all, it's a great honor to be invited and to be brought back to Germany in close partnership with the NDR. Now, this trip to Trier, hometown of Karl Marx, is in fact a journey of rediscovery for most of the Chinese. So 200 years on, there must have been many misinterpretations, if not abuse, of what the real Marxism was all about. And this one proved to be very substantial and fruitful for the following reasons. First of all, if you were to deliver huge influence on the rest of the world, like Karl Marx, he got to be born into a wealthy family, and his father was rich. Second, you got to marry a beautiful wife like Jenny, who's been so supportive of his pursuit of dreams. And third, you got to enjoy solid friendship like the one between Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Because Karl was penniless for a while when he was writing Das Kapital. Last but not least, I think to start a real career, to deliver huge influence, you got to be a real journalist, a critical one, opposing the tyranny of Prussian censorship and authorities in those days. Right?
He was fighting for press freedom.
Right. Now, the paths of America and Europe seem to diverge even further when Merkel and Macron failed to persuade Donald Trump to stay in the Iran nuclear deal and out of global trade war. But the issue remains whether paths of the EU and China will cross and converge in a post-order world. Europeans start to question the Belt and Road Initiative before forging substantial partnership. But both sides support multilateralism. To discuss the implications of these issues and more, today on the Chinese side of the co-production by CGTN and NDR, I'm very happy to be joined by Victor Gaojikai, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization, and Professor Zhang Xudong from New York University. He's also a visiting professor of Peking University.
And on the German side, we have Margot Schüller, who is with the German Institute for Global and Area Studies in Hamburg, my hometown, and Sebastian Heilmann, President at the MacArthur Institute for China Studies in Berlin, member also of the German-Chinese Dialogue Forum, funded by both governments.
This is indeed a dream team. My first question goes to Margot. Are you surprised that 200 years on, we've held many commemorative events to pay tribute to Karl Marx, and the word communism is enshrined in our constitution?
Not at all. I think that Marxism and Leninism are both very important guiding principles in China these days. And you have the CCP de facto acting as one-party state. And of course it says it claims Marxist values. And I think because the CCP has constantly adapted Marxism in view of the changing socio-economic environment, I think it is because it has been achieved to have this sort of legitimacy among the Chinese population.
But Carr condemned capitalism in, for example, Communist Manifesto in 1848.
Yeah.
How could China manage to handle the two entirely different ideological concepts together?
Yeah.
And
it's a very intelligent approach, because it has adapted now the Marxism ideology, and it was done so by, for example, redefining the capitalist reforms and the entrepreneurs. Without them, the Chinese success in the economic field would never have happened. So instead of saying capitalist system, they said socialist market economy with Chinese characteristics, and now Xi Jinping added in the new era. And the private entrepreneurs were called builders of socialism, and that allowed them to enter the Communist Party. So I think it's just a question of readapting and redefining.
Victor, do you think Margot has developed a precise understanding and correct interpretation about the role that the Chinese communist leadership plays in shaping the course of China's development?
Yes, I agree with what Margot said. I think for many years China actually was seized up with this big debate about capitalism versus socialism
and
or
this
communism.
year marks the 40th anniversary of China's reform and opening up. This is a landmark year.
Exactly. I think 40 years ago Deng Xiaoping came up with a great breakthrough, that is socialism with Chinese characteristics. And that system really enabled China to move forward with great amount of innovation, with new attitude towards the good elements in capitalism. So what China now has is actually a combined system based on socialism and communism, but it can take over whatever that works in the capitalist system. So it's a hybrid system, and this really generates all the emancipation for the productivity and creativity in China.
Victor, if I look at China from abroad, I see a huge success, but I also see lots of wealth accumulated. There is a huge gap between poor people and rich people. It's even wider than in the United States or in Germany. So how do you and how does the party reconcile these contradictions?
Yes, I think income...
First of all, do we have any class struggles, part of the doctrine that Karl Marx stood for over 1 century ago in China?
No, I don't think there will be class struggle anymore in China. There is indeed income disparity, and there are many people who feel they are disadvantaged. They do not get as much income from people around them. However, I think for anyone in China over the past 40 years, if he or she compared his income today with his or her income 10 years ago or 20 years ago, everyone is better off. So I think we really need to have a more objective way of looking at income and disparity. Eventually, I think very large income disparity is not good for social stability, and I think the Chinese government and the society at large need to come up with a way to deal with income disparity.
Sebastian, would Marx have accepted situations like we have them in China?
Difficult to say. I mean, there are many contradictions in Marx's writings itself. So probably he would still stress the kind of social disparities as a driver of history, as a driver of political development. But the technologies and also environmental issues that we are facing today are so different from what he had in mind, the context where he developed his ideas, that this must be kind of further developed. So we have a different situation in the 21st century, and I would really say that there's some interesting debate what we do with ecology and Marxism now. How do we integrate ecological issues into Marxist theory? These things are probably the issues that should be developed further. But if you treat Marx as a dogma, as a kind of static thinking, this clearly doesn't fit the world.
And you know, your question could have weakened up Karl Marx and brought him out of the Highgate Cemetery in London. What do you think of the theory of class struggles? I mean, Carr says in Communist Manifesto, the history of human societies is one of class struggles. What do you think of the value of this very important theory?
Well, I think it's easy and sometimes effective to start with the usual binary opposites, like what the introductory video did. Communism, capitalism, class struggle, or end of history, you name it. But however, we are witnessing right in front of us the breaking down of all these usual binary opposites. A new totality is emerging, which could potentially encompass all these differences and diversity. So I think that's what makes Marxism, or Marx's own thinking, interesting. For instance, class struggle as a concept, if we were to understand it narrowly in the 19th century or early 20th century context, as a life and death struggle between two contending parties, then of course it's over. We are not experiencing this anymore. But however, if we stick with the original Marxist teaching about the notion of class, namely there is a class of owners of means of production in terms of property ownership, and there are classes like I assume all of us who work, who sell our labor power, including our intellectual labor power, on the marketplace. We don't own means of production. Rather, we are workers, employees. I mean, then these kind of notions may still be useful as analytical frames of reference, as intellectual tools.
As we talk about it on an intellectual and from a philosophical perspective, Victor, let me ask you, what does the average Chinese know about Marx, the man in the street, as we call him?
Well, I think in many countries in the rest of the world, probably most people take Marx as a philosopher, as a political scientist, as a social activist, as a revolution. In China, it's very, very different, because China now is ruled by the Communist Party of China, and the whole political ideology in China traces its origin all the way to Karl Marx. So for Karl Marx and Marxism for China, at least for the ruling party, which has about 87 million party members, larger than the total population of Germany, Marxism and Karl Marx are the real symbol of the political justification and the political legitimacy of the Chinese system. That said, I don't think China is stuck with Marxism as if it is written or carved in stone. Marxism in China is a dynamic thing. It's ever-changing. And China needs to do the daily innovation to adapt whatever that is understood as Marxism to the realities in China.
But I'm afraid with the end
I'm
of
not
the
sure
Cold
Margaret
War.
agrees with that. Let me ask her, because she was shaking her head.
I just want to jump in off what you just said. One thing is that you said there is no class struggle, but of course you have contradictions. And I think President Xi Jinping just mentioned one. It is the contradiction of people's high expectation and the resources available. So this is a very important point. So mega trends all over the world is resource restriction. So you have to design your policy in a different way. So in the new area, you can say. So there's a contradiction.
Part of the economic success of China could be attributed to our huge efforts to separate ideology from our productivity and the huge campaign of promoting GDP growth. Well, I think one important factor emerging these days that threatens to derail China's course of sound economic development is the trade war between the United States and China.
I wouldn't call it a war yet. I would call it a trade spat. But we might as well slip into a trade war.
Right. So how does the EU position itself in this standoff between the two biggest economies? I am aware clearly that the EU and China are likely to join hand in submitting the case to the WTO for the settlement. How much common language do we share, and what are the disputes between the EU and China with regard to the future of globalization?
It's a very difficult situation for the EU presently, because traditionally, as you know, transatlantic relations and economic exchanges have been kind of the pillar of economic activity here. So this is something that really requires kind of shifting now the perspectives. So many people are discussing WTO itself, actually, presently, because the attacks on the world trade, multilateral world trade system and World Trade Organization are seen by many as carrying a real risk of collapse, actually. And if multilateral trade regime, if this regime collapses, it's equally bad for China and the EU at the same time. So what is being debated presently is how to save, how to kind of renew the WTO system, the World Trade Order, and this is something that's bigger than just the present trade conflict that we see. So there's really real debate about how to kind of bring the US administration back to the table, and this probably will require more coordinated action between China and the EU in the next future.
I think that one of the aims, being such a disruptive president of Donald Trump, is definitely to further the destruction of the WTO. That's clearly one of his aims. And second thing, I think, Margaret, maybe you could elaborate on that. He makes it quite difficult for the WTO in acting, because he's arguing in a trade spat with security reasons. This is against the national security in the United States. So it is difficult for the WTO to come in. But what should the EU do, and how should they sort of act at the moment?
I think we have lots of interest in common. We all want to have this multilateral trading system going further on, because we all have profiting from it. Germany
and China.
So we have the same interest, and of course we want to preserve the WTO system. But it's not, as you
Excuse
said,
me, Margaret, may I challenge your positive argument about the role WTO plays? In fact, we have been denied full-fledged market economic status by the European Union. To what degree do you think this further prevents our trade and economic exchange between the EU and China?
I don't think that it still plays a role, because we have changed our definition, as you had changed definition in your ideological area. We have changed the definition. There is no such thing as a market economy, a non-market economy. So if we look at dumping, we look at the specific conditions of companies, and this is a different story. But I think now there comes a problem with the relationship between China and the US, and our relations with the United States. It's more than economic relations. It's the political relation, and the US is being the guarantee of our security. So if we, for example, are not playing to their roles, if they can not persuade us.
If that could not be called a dispute, Sebastian.
Let me just one additional thought. Because WTO is so important to China and the EU, there is a real debate presently whether China wouldn't be in the position to sponsor a kind of, even people are talking about a Beijing round now, because the Doha round in the WTO didn't work out well. So to sponsor a Beijing round, to push forward the world trading system, to renew it, and to include all the new conditions that we have in the 21st century. This would be something that many in the EU would also hope for, that we could collaborate and in kind of updating this system, which is old, which is actually a 1990s system.
Why should the EU not go for a bilateral trade agreement with China? What is hindering this?
Perhaps Victor would have his strong voice on your question.
And I think the biggest challenge the world is faced with today is how to deal with the WTO. China definitely supports WTO. China wants to resolve all the trade disputes within the WTO system, whereas the United States seems to put itself above the WTO and is willing to trample the fundamental principles of WTO. And I think this creates a lot of problem in the world today. I think the challenge facing Germany and EU on the one hand, as well as China, is WTO. In this sense, I think China really is a beneficiary of the existing international order. China is very happy within the WTO. Of course, there are still some problems that China needs to continue to improve, of course.
For example, in the area of IPR protection, this is an issue that Europeans and Americans have been seriously concerned. What do you think of our huge efforts to invest in the digital technology and our our campaign to buy high-tech products that has been barred by the Trump administration and his predecessors, Xudong?
Well, I'm no expert on this, but for me, free trade has never been an innocent concept. Even though we all say, oh, it's a natural good, it has never been something neutral or even objective. It's always to be determined by real-world power relationship. Germany was not an advocate for free trade historically, and America used to be the leader. Now it's taking back from its former position. I think different nations or regions' attitude toward free trade or global agreement like WTO reflects their respective productivity, manufacturing, general national economy, and so on. So I'm, for one, not particularly, at least intellectually, troubled by U.S. attitude. It reflects its real structural weakness.
Do you want then to say that because America has lost its competitiveness, it is no longer supporting the WTO?
To some extent, I think it's a reflection of reality. So, and I wasn't sure about EU being an effective sort of a unit or category. Germany must be happy with WTO, with global competitive systems. But what about other European nations? I mean, they might be better off with closed borders.
Germany has its own trade spat with the United States, and you must always, when you look at Donald Trump, you must always look at the step behind. On the outside, we are very little concerned because it's 1.5% of the whole business we do with the United States that he questions and wants to slap tariffs on. But behind that, if there is anything like sanctions against Chinese companies, that will also hurt German companies producing in China. So many Chinese who are arguing that Germany should step to the side of China, supporting them against the United States. Is that a real prospect for the future? Is that really?
I don't think so, because there are still some different interests. Like our EU Commissioner for Trade, she argued that the overcapacity problem of steel, the punitive tariffs are directed to the overcapacity and the low prices and all that. This is not our problem, she said. So she was directed looking at China and overcapacity on the European market. So there are still some different interests in this respect.
To Ray's earlier question,
triangle of trade spats.
Absolutely. But going back to Ray's earlier question about China's investment in Germany, sometimes by buying German factories and technologies, right? I think that reflects China's interest in upgrading its industry and to join this sort of a German-led notion of Industry 4.0, which is very influential in China. But that this kind of interest in shoring up the kind of a productivity level with a real emphasis on production, on making things. I think to that extent, Germany and China firmly stand on one side of history, whereas financial superpowers, leaders of virtual economy, internet, symbolic power, they seem to stand on the other side of history, which we may or may not want to go in that
investments into German companies for the first time last year was reduced as compared to the years before. What are we looking at in the future, Sebastian? Is that going to pick up?
The interest of Chinese investors in German companies, especially industrial technologies, continues to be very strong. So this was probably caused by other factors, regulatory issues, and also policy kind of counter forces that built up in 2016-17. So this I would really see as caused by policy. Now the interest kind of trying to establish a competitive industry with Made in China 2025 technologies that are well defined there. This is something where actually Germany and China are in close competition actually in many ways now, moving forward to a competitive situation. And so this is also some kind of tense situation where we must really continue to talk about these issues.
And in fact, I have a question for Victor. When we look at the prospect of economic relationship between Germany and China. The two powerhouses separately. Sigmar Gabriel, Vice Chancellor as well as the Minister of the Economy, accused China of dividing the European Union. He said if we fail to get united, the European Union is likely to be divided by China's heavy investment in, for example, countries like Greece, Hungary, and Serbia, which is not a member state of the European Union at the moment. What do you think of our alleged export of overcapacity for the construction of infrastructure in underdeveloped European economies?
I think between China and Germany, both of our two countries need to keep pushing for more innovation and more creativity. In a sense, there is competition between China and Germany, but I think level of competition could be healthy, actually, could actually stimulate both China and Germany to do the right thing, so both of us can be more innovative. But talking about the Chinese attempt, for example, alleged attempt to split Europe, I don't think there is any such desire or intent. China is, of course, promoting 16+1, which is focusing on Eastern European and Southern European, the Balkan regions. But I think there is really big demand in that part of Europe for more infrastructure, for more connectivity, for more resources, and they are not coming very smoothly from Brussels. So I think...
But 16+1 has created a lot of distrust, actually, on the political level. I understand that on the ground people just want the investment.
Yeah,
but it's really...
Even our huge disputes on human rights, for example, our 16+1 cooperation with the Central Eastern European countries.
The only lady in this setup.
No, I just want to come back to your argument and also to your question. I think the real problem is not that we are not welcoming Chinese companies investing in those countries who lack infrastructure, Eastern, Central, Eastern European countries. But the thing is that we have a common policy, a transport policy, and this has very strong regulatory framework, including technical standards, including EU-wide bidding processes. So what we want, and I think this is the most important point, is that when Chinese companies invest, they have to go through our regulatory requirements. And then they cannot just go somewhere, but they have to do it together with the EU Commission. And of course, there is since 2015 this connectivity platform, which is exchanging plans on infrastructure building. And I think we should welcome it, but under the condition that our regulatory framework is adhered to.
I actually agree. I think there is a learning process both for China as well as EU and EU member states. I traveled extensively in the Baltic region, the Balkan region, etc. And I can see for myself there's huge demand for connectivity. And many governments over there are a little bit disadvantaged because they wait years and years for more money from Brussels. They are not coming. So I think EU also need to mobilize the resources in China so that the member states, especially in the eastern and southern part of Europe, can really benefit from the connectivity and the boosting up of the infrastructure projects.
The influence of Marxism may have been moved out of Central and Eastern European countries, but the 16+1 mechanism is gaining momentum in many ways. For example, don't you think those member states of the European Union in Central and Eastern Europe may have lowered their threshold for China's investment, and therefore we can have easy access to their markets? Look at our investment in the infrastructure area. So what
It's always a vice versa process. If China wants to invest in Europe, European states must be able to invest in China without regulations, tariffs, etc. And there's much to win and much to do for the Chinese government, I guess.
And the reciprocity issue has been brought up now in every single exchange.
Look at the car manufacturing industry, for example, and the president has reacted.
There are many areas of the Chinese economy that are really close to foreign investors, so it's something that's been really discussed, and the pressure is building on that. And these are I think the really large-scale challenges that we have to tackle now in the next 2 years already, because otherwise I fear that there might be a protectionist response also from the European Union. It's not in the interest of nobody. Yeah?
Let me just come back to the Chinese investment in other sectors than infrastructure, because of course they are welcome, and all the empirical research I did, and I read all the papers recently published, show that Chinese investment do not represent a threat but an opportunity in January. But there are some exceptions. And the exception, I think it started a few years ago with the buying of KUKA, you know, this robotic company. And when the Chinese investors came in and bid for the company, the share prices was 30% larger than any other German companies was able to pay. And so we were wondering where all this money came from. And after this, there was a strong discussion whether we should have a screening system looking at where the money comes from Chinese companies, what kind of access they have to state financing, and of course what the ownership structure is. So there is this change of mood in Germany related to this kind of
It takes hours for us to clarify the differences and disputes between the European Union and China. However, we do appreciate the participation by Germany, the UK and France in the AIIB. However, this prospects of a more solidarity is likely to be undermined by the United States, which made it very clear it will be to retreat from the Iran nuclear deal, and that threatens to divide the United States with the rest of the world. What is the position of the European Union? To my knowledge, European politicians have been very angry about the credibility of the Trump administration. Andres?
And there is an economical issue behind it. If you slap any company investing in Iran with sanctions, there are 10,000 Germans working. There are 120 German companies. So you introduce problems for the German economy through the back door. And that is the second thought of President Trump as well. So, but you want to answer your...
There's a lot of negotiations going on now, isn't there? Because it's really the case that the Europeans are extremely unhappy with this move by the American administration, and negotiations are going on all over the world. So there is some kind of counterbalancing taking place already. Kind of if the Trump administration crashes certain international multilateral agreements, you cannot just sit there and be passive. You have to do something to save these accords, and this is something that is being worked on now recently. So we really have to face a situation where these alliances and these allegiances are probably a little bit shifting in the next few years.
Victor and Xudong, nationalists in China are talking more about having a possible war, head-on confrontation between the United States and China, not only over Taiwan, but over the process of denuclearization. Now, the issue is whether, first of all, the Middle East may derail the attention, may distract the attention of the United States by involving the Trump administration in bloodshed between Israelis and Palestinians over the relocation of American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So what do you make of this prospect? Of course, China has no reason to be happy, but don't you think as a superpower, the sole superpower in the wake of the Cold War, the United States is stretching its front too much, excessively too much?
It's not the only superpower in the world anymore. We're talking about the big power relation between the US and China.
Well, I think one piece of advice for President Donald Trump is that the United States need to really exercise its global leadership in a very responsible way. It cannot be frivolous. It cannot just do whatever it wants to do. It cannot just disrupt the international order.
I mean, this is wish.
Yeah, but I think the withdrawal by the United States from the Iran nuclear deal is the first time, in my best judgment, ever since the end of the Second World War, where the United States policies and decisions are opposed by UK, by Germany, by France, by EU, and also by China and Russia. So I think this is really unprecedented, and I think eventually the United States may need to come to the conclusion that the more actions like this they take, the more damage to the U.S. leadership.
Margaret?
But if you look at the commercial implications for companies trading with Iran, the German companies and Chinese companies as well, they just weighed up what market is more important, and there is no means that they get protected by the German or European side. So, of course, they will stick to what the U.S. wants them to do.
What do you make of the possibility that we would increasingly use RMB for the settlement of major transactions in the oil-rich Middle East instead of relying on the oil dollars, as well we have been doing since the early 1970s when the U.S. dollar has been separated from the gold standard?
This would create huge leverage vis-à-vis the U.S. in the long run, clearly. This is one of the...
So this is one advice we can give to you.
Yeah,
well,
China
this is
is
something
already,
that's really important.
Yeah, China is already setting up oil futures market, which will settle the oil trade in renminbi rather than in US dollars. And I think this is a very important step in the right direction of promoting more internationalization of renminbi and build a world where there is not over-dependence on the dollar in the system.
It's a huge privilege for the U.S. I mean, the status of the dollar as the world reserve currency.
Michael and the gentlemen, yet another major issue I believe today we got to focus today on this occasion is the success of re-election Putin in Russia.
Let me just to round up this trade talk. I have one more question.
Are we talking about trade or geopolitics?
And, it's also geopolitics. Let me tell you that for the EU has to start to realize that it's entering the post-American era. And that is a huge break that we are seeing. We still have to realize it. And this is more, not only in the economical field, but also in the question of defense policies, etc. And this is slowly sinking in, rising defense budgets, etc. But to build trust within this triangle, US, China, Germany, we still have to check the mentalities. And Margaret has worked with Huawei on a study how the Germans see China and the Chinese see Germany. And there are some surprising facts. And maybe let us just quickly look at that before we go to geostrategics.
Yeah, what is very surprising that although China is our main trading partner and economic partner in general, among all the European countries, our perception of China is not as good as it should be. So it's quite negative. And it's so surprising.
Not because of the negative media coverage.
This is maybe one point, but it is also because our trade relation and economic relation is very strong, and of course we see that China is rising, and we had very high expectation of a changing China. And now we are all disappointed because we thought that China will become more liberal, more democratic, just following the Western model. And because of this disappointment, I think most of us who think that China is not a good player in many fields, there has just sort of given up, and there's negative impact.
Chinese are seeing Germany much more positive?
Of course. But it's mainly in the field of political questions, like related to...
Michael, in response to your mild criticism and high expectations for China, Xudong, there's a popular assumption in China that neoliberalism is beating a global retreat. We see a more diversified spectrum of public opinions with regard to the rise of China and its global implications. China is trying to walk its own way, navigating its own course of development instead of following the example of liberal democracy that Francisco Fukuyama said in his book Last Man in the History, that liberal democracy would be the only solution and the only future. He turns out to be wrong, and he's been proved wrong. China, under the communist leadership, turned out to be the second biggest economy, the largest trading power in such a short period of 4 decades. What do you think of the different path? What do you think of the different path China walks? They're talking about disappointment about China. But what do you think of your vision?
It's understandable. I think post-war Germany has been the sort of poster boy of self-reformation, of playing by the rules, of harboring universal sentiments and doing good, and self-reflection, feeling guilty. Hitting all the right notes and sincerely, not like to pretension by pretension. So when China, this sort of a big player, jumping into the pool, splashing, creating this sort of all kinds of imbalances and unpredictability, I think Germans, to some extent, feel concerned or uneasy. That's more than understandable. However, I think China's path, which is oftentimes in Western media compared to pre-Second World War, sort of a German particular path, sort of the German way, as opposed to the liberal, decadent, Anglo-Franco way of liberal bourgeois civilization on the one hand, and this Russian or Asian sort of this totalitarianism. It's been featured very prominently. I was wondering to what extent Germans, ordinary Germans, as well as German intellectuals, the German elite, agree or disagree with this kind of a media perception of China. Namely, they somewhat reminded us of late 19th century, early 20th century Germany.
No, I think this, we have to state clear, this was a poll being done amongst the population. It's not about politics, not about politicians.
It's a perception, it's not reality.
We're talking about perception.
This is a program to create more understanding, and I think we should think about how we could actually change this kind of policy. Yep. Victor, my understanding is that...
Should we discuss geopolitical implications of Putin winning the campaign success? Because Russia is of a more immediate threat, bigger immediate threat to Germany and the European Union. And I wonder if you could take into consideration the wisdom of Bismarck, who united Germany in era of upheavals, instead of antagonizing both Russia and China.
No chance for that.
Yeah, let me add a point. I think whatever the Germans...
Sorry, we come back to Putin.
Later. I'll be very quick. Let me add one point. Whatever the Germans now think about China, let me emphasize one point. That is, in China, there is high level of admiration for Germany.
Yes.
For the high quality of the products, for the commitment to get their jobs done in the right way, for example. We need to focus on the goodwill in China and also a tremendous amount of admiration and respect that the Chinese people and Chinese government entities and corporates have for Germany in general. So this is the common ground which can really...
anxiety about jobs, which is everywhere when jobs are in question. And the second thing is that you have to, also in the West, we have to realize that China is not following the Western way. It wants to build its own system, its own development bank, etc., its own sphere of interests, like Russia.
So the main discussion, I don't think Russia is a very productive point of reference for this current discussion, because let's call it Chinese capitalism, just for the sake of argument. The Chinese capitalism, as a form of state capitalism, has created its own model. But to a great extent, this is because it's sheer scale, the magnitude, the domestic market, and the industrial capacity across the board. It's not something like a low capital intensity, kind of a low value added sector, but also high tech and sophisticated production and so on and so forth. So that kind of a sheer scale combined with a certain cultural continuity, newfound political confidence, and geopolitical advantages, it creates a bloc of its own. To a certain degree, this is almost something natural, historical. I mean, of course, we should be more analytical and critical about it, but there's something to...
China was aware of Russia, never trusted Russia. So has that changed, that kind of view of Russia from a Chinese perspective?
No, I think Russia, whatever its current situation, will remain a very important international power for years and decades and probably for centuries to come. Anyone who underestimates Russia or rights of Russia will suffer to his or her own disadvantage.
Let me answer your question.
So Russia will remain a very important country, and China wants to deal with Russia as it is, and that's why President Xi Jinping has developed a very good relations with President Putin. And the two countries want to respect each other, even though Russia's economy is much smaller than the Chinese economy. And
before we move on to yet another flashpoint geopolitically, in response to your question, Andrews, which is a very important one, the issue of trust between Russia and China, let me cite Mr. Yang Jiechi, currently member of the Politburo, a very important decision-making body in our politics, as saying at a press conference a few years ago when he was the foreign minister. He said, look, the close strategic consultation between Russia and China on almost all geopolitical issues has set a very good example for the landscape of geopolitics in the post-Cold War era. There's basically no disputes between the two countries. Let me go back to the South China Sea. Okay, other than the flashpoint of Taiwan, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, even agreed to join the patrol in South China Sea. And China, of course, feels this is none other than overseas interference. And Greece as well as Hungary, separately stepped in to block a statement of the European Union on the issue of territorial claims in the South China Sea. What do you think of the important issue of building solidarity, first of all, within the European Union, before you step out to interfere?
The trouble is that by law and by contract, we have unanimous votes in Europe, and sort of, if we're discussing at the moment...
The resolutions are a problem, that's true.
Two-thirds
We've seen that Hungary and Greece didn't take part in that, didn't support this unified resolution, was seen as a manifestation of Chinese influence in those countries. So this is one of the examples that's frequently quoted as kind of an argument for seeing China as a divisive force in the European Union. So this is something that probably shouldn't happen too often, because it creates severe distrust and tensions in all other capitals in Europe, because they tried to do something. The arbitral court was there was this judgment, and people wanted to make a statement on it. And if the EU doesn't manage to make statements on such crucial cases, unified statements, many people would say, okay, then
my understanding, Sebastian, my understanding about the consensus building in continental Europe is that it's based on value orientation of the Europeans. But last year, I talked to a European policymaker in the Rhode Island of the agency administered the dialogue of civilization. He said, Ray, what's the point of having free elections when our economy keeps declining? And that perhaps somehow explains why Greece is getting so close to Chinese investment.
Ray, whilst you are explaining, we have the rare chance to have Chinese experts here in this discussion with dialogue. What we like to understand in Germany is, after the National Party Congress, the term limits of the presidency have been lifted. How should we see this? We are at odds, guessing why is this happening at this point, and what is the strategic thought behind this development?
And a follow-up question,
maybe to Xudong and to Victor.
Very good question. A follow-up question on the basis of your one is, late founding father of Singapore, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, said, a majority of the Chinese feel very comfortable with having a strong central government in navigating their own course. What do you make of European concerns and the vision of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew?
It's not concerns yet. It's just we would like to know, and not guessing in Europe, and I think you can perfectly answer that question.
Allow me to make a point. I think in 1981, when the Chinese Constitution at that time was amended to put the limitation for 2 terms for the presidency, it made all the sense. However, the situation in China has changed tremendously over the past several decades, and I think the Chinese leader, in this case President Xi Jinping, he's a trinity leader. He's the General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, he's the Chairman of the Central Military Commission, and he's also the President of the People's Republic of China. In reality, if I may make a point, the most important position is the General Secretary and the Chairman of the Central Military Commission. The presidency itself, for a while at least, was considered more symbolic. However, I think there is tremendous amount of support over the past 5 years or so for President Xi Jinping for his outstanding work fighting against corruption, standing firm on the international stage, promoting One Belt, One Road, defending WTO and promoting globalization, for example. So I think there is tremendous amount of support within the Communist Party of China, within the Chinese people, for him to hang on longer as president, in addition to continue to be the General Secretary of the party and the Chairman of the Central Military Commission.
When you heard that? I mean, could you believe it in the first place, and what did you make of it?
But Sebastian, let me first of all ask you a question. Did you know anything about...
Ray, I think you should answer that question first.
We need to have a prerequisite before having a very good answer from this China expert. Now, do you know anything about what happened in Chinese politics concerning the disunity, the discrepancies in our voices that led to corruption before Xi Jinping took office? The previous administrations ahead of Xi Jinping. I mean, that may have explained
the need for unified leadership, right. I think that's understood also in the West. The issue came up in the West that when we heard this message, the constitutional change, many people responded, now he wants to become a lifelong ruler. And this is now the issue. It boils down to this issue. It's not the third term is not the point.
Excuse me, is he President Xi Jinping aiming to have a lifelong ruler?
I mean, I would be surprised if he will remain a lifetime.
You know, your take?
But
You don't think so?
But I think President Xi Jinping will remain for many years to come.
If it's 3 terms,
the supreme leader of China, the paramount
if it's
leader.
lifelong, and then you see we have these traditions, these historical experiences.
Yeah, but
Your thoughts?
I would like to remind you that there are also other issues like a new role for the Communist Party. So it's becoming the institution of last resort for everything. So I think we have to look at this development, maybe thinking that in the last 5 years economic development was not as good as expected. And there are many problems like China's high indebtedness. So how can you solve this problem? By restructuring governments, and this has been done. And I think the idea of combining regulatory bodies to better control the financial market is a very good one, because not only in Western countries we have discussed whether China is maybe creating a new financial disorder and maybe as well inflicting our economies. So I think there are some other questions related to these 2 sessions, and one is restructuring the economy and trying to realize what Xi Jinping has promised the population, the realization of the China dream, better living conditions in the not too distant future. So the pressing problems are there. And
Margaret and the gentleman here, by the end of the day, the very important issue concerning why China has developed so quickly is the matter of governance that China exercises. This year is the 40th anniversary of China's reform and opening up. Now, in your review concerning China's governance and the excesses of leadership, what do you think of the stories that we need to convey to our German friends?
I think there are many reasons explaining for China's huge transformation. But I think in essence, it boils down to 2 things. One is China wants to maintain stability at home and also keeping peace in the world. Keeping peace doesn't mean that China has the ability to prevent any war in the world. Keeping peace means China does not want to be involved in a war, and maintaining stability means China wants to make sure stability and continuity of the policies can be maintained. I think this really explains why China over the past 40 years has managed to develop much faster and much more comprehensively than almost any other country. Because in many other countries you do not have stability at home, and then in the case of the United States, for example, it keeps getting involved in
very
wars
quickly, before we wrap up this very enlightening discussion, Xu Dong, which should come first in the pecking order? Individual liberty or political order during the period of transformation for a young, dynamic market like China?
Well, again, if you allow me to say this as an academic, I think these traditional binary opposites are precisely something we want to avoid. We're looking at a new totality, a new configuration, new ways of thinking. For instance, the 40 years anniversary of reform, I think should remind us the initial sort of the impact of a Chinese Revolution, which led to the historical processes of Chinese industrialization. I think now we are witnessing the dividends of full, comprehensive industrialization, the largest in scale in terms of world historical development, compared to Chinese industrialization, which has recently reached its full. Even German industrialization, Japanese industrialization, Soviet industrialization, these spectacular historical precedents pale in front of this one. This is the real epic story. And the Chinese social forms, state forms, these kind of things piggyback on this an industrial China on the rise.
But at what price? What are the price for that?
At what price,
yes.
Exactly.
But this is a very dynamic discussion.
Margaret and gentlemen, I think China should follow its way, and the Western countries will probably not reread Marx again, but they will be concerned with social justice and social equality. And I think everybody who has listened and watched this dialogue and this round, very interesting, very lively. I think Yang Rui and CGTN for cooperating with NDR on this program and foster understanding and better relations. Ray.
We all have the benefits of doubt in a skeptical age concerning the future of deglobalization or reglobalization. It's a matter of how we can review the history of not only Marxism but also the way China develops. We also focus in a very constructive way on the issue of a trade standoff between the United States and China and geopolitical landscape in continental Europe following Brexit, perhaps. This is indeed a very enlightening brainstorming session. Thank you all for the participation.
Thanks, and thanks to our Chinese guests.
Thank you.